She never thought her routine trip to the mall would end in public humiliation, until a manager kicked her out for no reason at all. Evelyn Walker had seen a lot in her 72 years. She'd seen segregation, the civil rights movement, and had lived through the long struggle of being a black woman in a world that so often devalued her worth. But despite it all, she held her head high. She lived her life quietly now, tucked away in a modest house on the outskirts of town. Her children were grown, and most had left the state in pursuit of lives that took them far from the place she called home. Evelyn didn't mind much. She had always been a woman who found contentment in the small, simple things: the morning sun peeking through her curtains, the sound of birds in the oak trees by her window, and the little garden she tended with care. On this particular afternoon, Evelyn decided to make her routine trip to the nearby shopping mall. It wasn't an extravagant place, but it had everything she needed: a grocery store, a pharmacy, and a small cafe where she liked to sit with a cup of coffee. The mall was a hub of activity in the small town, drawing in people from all walks of life, and for Evelyn, it was a way to remain connected to the world around her, a place where she could sit quietly and watch the bustle of humanity. She had always been a proud woman, gracious, polite, and carrying herself with the dignity that only comes with age and wisdom. On this day, she wore her Sunday best: a simple, modest dress in soft blue fabric, her hair neatly tied back, and her favorite leather purse slung over her shoulder. She didn't think much about her appearance as she walked through the mall's automatic doors, greeted by the familiar sound of piped-in music and the hum of shoppers moving about. It was a typical day, and she was just another elderly woman making her way through the world. But as Evelyn approached the grocery store entrance, something felt off. There was a strange tension in the air, a shift in the way people seemed to be moving around her, avoiding her gaze, quickening their pace as if they were uncomfortable with her presence. She noticed it, but brushed it off at first. Perhaps she was being too sensitive. After all, she had experienced subtle forms of discrimination her entire life. It was a part of her reality that she had learned to endure. As she turned toward the grocery store entrance, she was suddenly stopped by a stern voice. "Excuse me, ma'am." Evelyn looked up, startled by the sharpness in the tone. A tall, burly man in a security uniform stood in front of her, blocking her path. His face was hard, unsmiling. "Yes?" she said softly, her heart already sinking, though she had no idea why. "I'm going to have to ask you to leave the premises," the man said, folding his arms across his chest. Evelyn blinked, confused. "Leave? I don't understand. I just got here. I was about to do some shopping." "Mall policy," the guard replied, his tone cold and dismissive. "But what policy? I haven't done anything wrong. I just want to buy some groceries," Evelyn explained, her voice trembling slightly. "I said you need to leave." "Now?" the guard insisted, raising his voice slightly, drawing the attention of a few passers-by who stopped to watch the exchange with curious eyes. Evelyn's confusion turned to hurt. She could feel the sting of humiliation rising in her chest. She had never been treated like this before, not in her own community. She wasn't some unruly teenager or a troublemaker. She was an elderly woman, a grandmother, a churchgoer, a longtime resident of the town. What could possibly be the reason for this? "Is there a problem here?" A new voice broke into the conversation, and both Evelyn and the security guard turned toward the speaker. It was the mall manager. He was a young man, not more than 30, with slicked back hair and a sharp, impatient expression on his face. His eyes flicked over Evelyn dismissively before settling on the security guard, as if she weren't even worth addressing directly. "Yes, sir," the security guard said. "This woman refuses to leave even though I told her she needs to go." The manager's gaze shifted back to Evelyn, his lips curling into a sneer. "You heard the man. We don't need your kind here." Evelyn's heart stopped for a moment. "Your kind." The words hung in the air, dripping with malice, cutting through the facade of civility like a knife. Her eyes widened as the meaning behind the words sank in. She had experienced racism throughout her life, but it had been years since anyone had spoken to her so blatantly, with such hatred. "My kind?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I'm just here to shop. I haven't done anything wrong." The manager took a step closer, towering over her small frame. "I don't care what you think you're doing. This is my mall, and I don't want people like you hanging around making customers uncomfortable." Evelyn felt her stomach churn with a mix of anger and disbelief. "But I've shopped here for years," she stammered, her voice shaking now. "I come here all the time." "Not anymore," the manager said coldly. "Now get out before I have you forcibly removed." Tears welled up in Evelyn's eyes. She wanted to stand up for herself, to fight back, to tell this man that he had no right to treat her this way. But the weight of his words, the power of his position, and the coldness in his eyes made her feel small, powerless. She had lived a long life, survived hardships that this young man could never imagine, but in this moment, she felt utterly defeated. As she turned to leave, the manager's final words stung her like a whip. "Go back to where you came from." The words echoed in her mind, each syllable laced with venom. She paused for a moment, her back to the manager, her fists clenched at her sides. She wanted to say something, to turn around and confront him, but she couldn't. Years of enduring racism had taught her that sometimes silence was the only defense. And so, with her head bowed, she walked away. The walk back to her car felt like a lifetime. Each step was heavier than the last, weighed down by the humiliation and pain of what had just happened. People in the mall stared at her as she passed, some with pity in their eyes, others with indifference. No one stepped in to help. No one said a word in her defense. By the time she reached her car, Evelyn's hands were trembling. She fumbled with her keys, struggling to unlock the door. Tears streamed down her face as she finally collapsed into the driver's seat, her body shaking with sobs. How could this happen? How could someone treat her, an elderly woman, with such cruelty? How could the color of her skin still provoke such hatred in the world? Evelyn sat there in the parking lot for what felt like hours, the weight of the day pressing down on her. She thought of her children, her grandchildren, and all the struggles they would still have to face in a world that had not yet learned to see beyond skin color. She had fought for their future, had hoped for a better world for them. But today, she felt as though nothing had changed. The following days were a blur for Evelyn. She stayed home, avoiding the world outside, unable to shake the humiliation that clung to her like a shadow. Word spread quickly through the town about what had happened at the mall, and soon, friends and neighbors began calling to offer their support. Some were outraged, others saddened, but all of them shared in the disbelief that such blatant racism could still exist in their community. It wasn't long before the local news caught wind of the story. Reporters began knocking on Evelyn's door, asking for interviews, wanting to know how she felt, what she planned to do next. But Evelyn wasn't ready to talk. She wasn't ready to relive the pain of that day. Her pastor, Reverend Johnson, was the first person she confided in. He came to her house one afternoon, sitting with her on the porch, his hands folded in his lap as he listened to her story. "I don't understand," Evelyn said, her voice thick with emotion. "I've lived here my whole life. I've never caused trouble for anyone. Why would they treat me like that?" Reverend Johnson sighed, his eyes filled with sorrow. "Racism is an ugly thing, Evelyn. It doesn't care about who you are, how good a person you've been, or how much you've given to this community. Some people carry hatred in their hearts and they spread that poison wherever they go." "But what am I supposed to do now?" she asked, her voice trembling. "How do I move forward from this?" The Reverend took a deep breath. "You can't let their hate define you. You've lived a life of dignity, Evelyn. You've raised children, worked hard, and contributed to this community. Don't let one man's cruelty take that away from you." Evelyn nodded, though the weight of the words didn't lessen the pain she felt. She knew the Reverend was right. But it didn't make it any easier to move past the humiliation she had endured. In the days that followed, Evelyn found herself caught in a whirlwind of emotions. She oscillated between anger, sadness, and a deep sense of betrayal. This town had been her home for decades. How could something like this happen here, in a place where she had always felt safe? But then something unexpected happened. People began to rally around her. It started with her neighbors, then spread to the wider community. Protests were organized outside the mall with signs that read, "Justice for Evelyn," and "End Racism Now." The local NAACP chapter got involved, demanding that the mall manager be fired and that the security guard face disciplinary action. Evelyn was overwhelmed by the support. Strangers reached out to her, offering words of comfort and encouragement. Young people from the community, both black and white, joined the protests, determined to make their voices heard. She was hesitant at first, unsure of whether she wanted to be the center of such a public outcry. But as the days passed, Evelyn realized that this wasn't just about her. It was about something bigger, about standing up against the injustice that had been done to her, and about making sure that no one else would have to endure the same pain. One evening, after much contemplation, she decided to attend one of the protests. She arrived at the mall to find a large crowd gathered outside, chanting and holding signs. For the first time in days, she felt a sense of hope stir within her. As she made her way through the crowd, people began to notice her. The chanting quieted, and all eyes turned toward her. The sea of faces parted, and Evelyn found herself standing at the center of the gathering. Tears filled her eyes as she looked around at the people who had come to support her. It was then that she realized she wasn't alone. The mall manager's cruelty had tried to make her feel small, insignificant, and unworthy. But the outpouring of love and support from her community had reminded her of her strength, of the dignity that no one could take away. Taking a deep breath, Evelyn raised her head high. The crowd watched her in silence, waiting for her to speak. As Evelyn stood there, staring at the crowd that had gathered to support her, she could feel the weight of their expectations. They were waiting for her to speak, to tell her story, to give voice to the injustice she had suffered. But her voice felt trapped in her throat, weighed down by years of enduring silent slights, unspoken words, and quiet acquiescence to a world that had not always welcomed her. Her fingers gripped the small microphone that had been passed to her. She looked out over the sea of faces, some familiar, some not, and her breath caught in her chest. The moment felt so much bigger than her, and for the first time in her life, she felt truly seen. Not as a grandmother, a retiree, or just another black woman in town, but as Evelyn Walker, a person with a story that mattered. I don't know what to say," she began, her voice trembling slightly. A soft murmur of encouragement rippled through the crowd. People stood in respectful silence, waiting for her to find the words. "I've lived in this town for over 40 years," Evelyn said slowly, her voice gaining strength with each word. "I've raised my children here. I've seen this place grow and change. But what happened to me that day? It wasn't just about one person being mean. It was about something deeper, something that has been part of this town, this country, for a very long time." She paused, her eyes scanning the crowd. "I was kicked out of that mall because of the color of my skin. No other reason. I wasn't loud. I wasn't causing trouble. I was just trying to buy groceries, just like anyone else. But to that man, I didn't belong there." A hush fell over the crowd. The weight of her words settled on their shoulders, making them stand a little taller, a little more alert to the injustice in their midst. "I've faced racism before," Evelyn continued, her voice steady now. "It's not new to me, but what shocked me that day wasn't just the words. It was the feeling of being powerless, of not having anyone in that moment to stand up for me. I didn't know what to say. I didn't know how to fight back. And for a moment I felt like I didn't matter." Tears welled up in her eyes, but she blinked them away, her resolve strengthening. "But I do matter. We all do. No matter our age, our color, or our background, We deserve to be treated with respect and dignity. That's why I'm standing here today. Not just for myself, but for everyone who has ever been made to feel small. For everyone who has been silenced by the hate and ignorance of others. The crowd erupted in applause, a wave of emotion sweeping over them. Evelyn stood taller, her heart pounding with the sense of solidarity she felt from those around her. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about the countless others who had suffered in silence, about changing the fabric of her community. Over the next few weeks, the protests grew larger. The story of Evelyn Walker's mistreatment spread far beyond the small town. National media outlets picked up the story, and soon journalists from across the country were descending on the town to cover the protests. People came from neighboring cities, joining the movement and demanding justice. The mall's management tried to stay silent at first, hoping the uproar would die down, but it only grew louder. Calls for the manager's resignation mounted, and boycotts of the mall began to take effect. Businesses within the mall started to suffer as fewer people came to shop, unwilling to support a place that had shown such blatant racism. Evelyn watched it all unfold with a mixture of awe and humility. She had never asked to become a symbol of resistance, but now that she was, she knew she couldn't turn back. Her friends and family rallied around her, offering their support, while community leaders stepped forward to guide the movement. But even as the protests continued, there was a deep sadness that lingered in Evelyn's heart. She couldn't shake the memory of the way the mall manager had looked at her, the way he had spoken to her as if she were less than human. No amount of protests or public outcry could erase the sting of that moment, the raw pain of being dehumanized because of her skin color. One afternoon, as Evelyn sat in her living room, watching the news coverage of the latest protest, her phone rang. It was her daughter, Angela. "Mom, how are you holding up?" Angela asked, her voice filled with concern. Evelyn sighed, leaning back in her chair. "I'm fine, baby. It's been a lot." "I know," Angela said softly. "I've been watching the news. It's amazing how many people are supporting you. You're making a real difference." "I'm not sure I ever wanted to make a difference," Evelyn replied with a small, bitter laugh. "I just wanted to buy my groceries in peace." Angela was silent for a moment, and Evelyn could hear the hesitation in her daughter's voice. "Mom, I know this is hard, but you've always taught us to stand up for what's right, even when it's not easy. You've been doing that your whole life. This is no different." Evelyn closed her eyes, letting her daughter's words sink in. She had always believed in fighting for justice, but now that the fight was hers, it felt different, more personal, more painful. "I don't know if I'm strong enough for this," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "You are," Angela said firmly. "You've been strong your whole life. You're one of the strongest women I know, and you're not alone in this. We're all behind you. The whole town is behind you." Tears welled up in Evelyn's eyes again, and she quickly wiped them away. "Thank you, baby. I don't know what happens next." "What happens next is that we keep fighting," Angela said. "We don't let them get away with this." Evelyn nodded, even though her daughter couldn't see her. "You're right. We can't let this go." In the weeks that followed, Evelyn became more involved in the movement. She attended meetings with local activists, worked with attorneys who were pursuing legal action against the mall, and even began speaking at public events about her experience. At first, it was daunting, stepping into a role she had never imagined for herself. But with each speech she gave, each protest she attended, Evelyn's confidence grew. The local media dubbed her the voice of change, and her face appeared on TV screens and in newspapers across the state. She was invited to speak at city council meetings, community forums, and even at schools, where she shared her story with young people, hoping to inspire them to stand up against injustice in their own lives. Through it all, Evelyn remained humble. She didn't see herself as a hero or a symbol. She was just a woman who had been mistreated, who had found the strength to speak out. But as the weeks turned into months and the protests continued, Evelyn realized that her story was part of something much larger. It wasn't just about one woman's experience. It was about a community coming together to demand change. One morning, months after the incident, Evelyn received a letter in the mail. It was from the mall's management team offering a formal apology for what had happened to her. They admitted that the manager's actions had been unacceptable and promised to implement new diversity training for all employees. The manager himself had resigned under public pressure, and the mall's owners were eager to put the incident behind them. But for Evelyn, it wasn't enough. She knew that an apology wouldn't erase the pain she had felt that day. It wouldn't undo the years of subtle racism she had endured throughout her life. And it certainly wouldn't change the fact that there were still people in the world who saw her as less than because of the color of her skin. But it was a start. Evelyn folded the letter and set it aside. She had a meeting to attend later that day, another gathering of activists planning their next steps in the fight for racial equality. The work wasn't over. It might never be over. But for the first time in a long while, Evelyn felt hopeful. Hopeful that change was possible. Hopeful that the world her grandchildren would grow up in might be better than the one she had known. And most of all, hopeful that she, an elderly black woman who had once been humiliated and dismissed, could make a difference. Evelyn stood up, grabbed her purse, and headed out the door. She had work to do. As Evelyn left her house that afternoon, she couldn't help but reflect on how much her life had changed in such a short amount of time. A few months ago, she had been just another elderly woman in the town, quietly living out her days, content with her routine. But now she was a public figure, thrust into the spotlight by an event she would have preferred never to experience. The weight of that new role sometimes felt too much to bear. Every time she left her home, people approached her, recognizing her from the news or from the protests. Some offered kind words, a smile, or a nod of solidarity. Others wanted to ask her questions, hear more of her story, or take photos with her as if she were a celebrity. She never knew how to respond to that. She wasn't a celebrity, and she didn't crave the attention. All she had ever wanted was to be treated with the same respect as anyone else. But it wasn't about what she wanted anymore. It was about the movement that had sprung up around her, and the people who looked to her for inspiration. For so long, Evelyn had stayed silent, accepting the little injustices she encountered as part of the fabric of life. Now she realized that silence was no longer an option. As she arrived at the local community center for the meeting, she was greeted by familiar faces, people who had become like family to her over the past few months. Reverend Johnson was there, as always, along with several members of the local NAACP chapter. There were young activists, too, full of energy and ideas, eager to push the movement forward. They met in a small room at the back of the center, where folding chairs were arranged in a circle. The atmosphere was one of determination and camaraderie, but there was also a sense of exhaustion. The protests had been going on for months now, and while they had made significant progress, forcing the resignation of the mall manager and drawing national attention to the issue of racism in their town, there was still so much more to be done. Evelyn took her seat at the head of the circle, as she had done at every meeting since becoming one of the movement's central figures. She still wasn't used to it, but she had grown more comfortable with the role. She knew that people looked to her for guidance, for strength, and she did her best to live up to their expectations. Reverend Johnson called the meeting to order, and the group began discussing their next steps. There was talk of organizing a town hall meeting, where they could invite local officials and business owners to discuss racial discrimination and ways to combat it. They also wanted to launch a campaign to raise awareness about the importance of diversity training in local businesses and schools. As the discussion unfolded, Evelyn found herself listening more than speaking. She appreciated the passion and ideas of the younger activists, but she also knew that change would take time. She had lived long enough to see that the wheels of progress often turned slowly, and that while protests and public demonstrations were important, lasting change would require more than just speeches and marches. When it was her turn to speak, she cleared her throat and leaned forward slightly in her chair. "I think all of this is important," she said, her voice calm but firm. We need to keep up the pressure, keep raising our voices. But we also need to remember that change doesn't happen overnight. It takes time, and it takes persistence. We can't get discouraged if things don't change as quickly as we'd like. Several heads nodded in agreement, and Evelyn continued. Back when I was a young woman, we fought for the right to sit at any counter, to ride in the front of the bus, to go to schools that were equal. It took years to get where we are now, and we still have so much further to go. But we can't give up. We have to keep pushing forward one step at a time. The room was quiet for a moment as her words sank in. There was a shared understanding among them, especially among the older members of the group, of just how long and difficult the road to equality had been. But there was also a sense of hope, a belief that their efforts could make a difference, just as those who had come before them had made a difference. Reverend Johnson spoke up after Evelyn finished, his deep voice filling the room. Evelyn is right. This is a marathon, not a sprint. But we have the strength, and we have the support of this community behind us. We're not just fighting for ourselves. We're fighting for the generations that come after us. The meeting continued, with more discussions about logistics, planning, and outreach. But Evelyn's mind began to drift, her thoughts returning to the letter she had received from the mall's management. The apology had been long overdue, and while it was a small victory, she couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't enough. The resignation of the manager had been necessary, but it felt like a token gesture, a way for the mall to save face rather than a true reckoning with the deep-rooted problem of racism. After the meeting adjourned, Evelyn walked outside, feeling the cool evening breeze against her skin. The sun was setting, casting a warm orange glow across the sky. She stood there for a moment, watching the world around her, thinking about the fight that lay ahead. "Mrs. Walker?" Evelyn turned to see a young woman approaching her. She recognized her from the protests, a college student who had been one of the most vocal supporters of the movement. "Yes, dear," Evelyn replied, offering a kind smile. The young woman hesitated for a moment before speaking. "I just wanted to thank you for everything. You've been such an inspiration to me, to all of us. I don't know if I would have had the courage to speak out if it weren't for you." Evelyn felt a lump form in her throat. She had never thought of herself as an inspiration. She had just been trying to stand up for herself, to reclaim her dignity. But hearing those words from this young woman reminded her of the impact she was having, even if she didn't always realize it. "Thank you," Evelyn said softly. "But it's not just me. It's all of us working together. We have to support each other, lift each other up." The young woman nodded, her eyes shining with gratitude. "I know. But you showed us the way." Evelyn smiled again, feeling a warmth in her chest. "We all have a role to play, dear. Just keep speaking out, keep pushing for what's right. That's how we make change." As the young woman walked away, Evelyn stood there for a while longer, watching the fading light. She thought about her own journey, the years of struggle, the quiet resilience that had carried her through so many challenges. And now, in the twilight of her life, she had found herself at the center of a movement she hadn't expected, but one that she had embraced with all her heart. The weeks continued to pass, and the protests began to evolve. They were no longer just about the mall or the manager who had wronged Evelyn. They had become a rallying cry for the entire town, a demand for an end to the subtle and overt forms of racism that had persisted for too long. People were organizing not just around the mall, but also addressing inequities in the local schools, workplaces, and law enforcement. Evelyn found herself more involved than ever, attending meetings with local officials, speaking at town halls, and even participating in diversity and inclusion workshops organized by the town council. She had become a voice for the community, and while it was exhausting at times, it also filled her with a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years. But despite the progress they were making, there were still setbacks. Some people in the town were resistant to the changes being proposed. They didn't want to confront the uncomfortable reality of racism in their midst. Others dismissed the protests as unnecessary, claiming that discrimination wasn't a problem in their town. Evelyn encountered this resistance firsthand during a particularly heated town hall meeting. As she stood at the podium, speaking about the need for better representation in local government and more inclusive policies, a man in the audience interrupted her. "I don't understand why we're making such a big deal out of this," the man said, his voice loud and dismissive. "Racism isn't an issue here, people just need to stop being so sensitive." A murmur of disapproval rippled through the room, but the man continued, undeterred. "This town's been fine the way it is for years. Why are we trying to change everything now?" Evelyn felt a surge of anger rise within her. She had heard these arguments before, countless times, from people who refused to see the reality of discrimination because it didn't affect them personally. But this time she wasn't going to let it go unanswered. She looked directly at the man, her voice steady and calm. "Sir, with all due respect, you don't get to decide what is or isn't an issue for the people who live here. Just because you haven't experienced racism doesn't mean it doesn't exist." The man shifted uncomfortably in his seat, but Evelyn didn't back down. The tension in the town hall room thickened as Evelyn stood firm. Her heart pounded, but she remained calm, holding the gaze of the man who had interrupted her. The silence that followed her words was heavy, but Evelyn knew it was a moment that demanded truth. She couldn't let the conversation be dismissed, not after everything that had happened. "You might think this town has been fine the way it is," Evelyn continued, her voice now strong and unwavering. "But it hasn't been fine for everyone. For people like me who have had to live with the weight of discrimination, both spoken and unspoken, it hasn't been fine at all. We've had to carry that burden for years while pretending everything was okay. But we're done pretending." A few murmurs of agreement rippled through the room, and Evelyn could feel the tide turning. The man who had interrupted her shifted in his seat, uncomfortable with the attention now focused on him. He opened his mouth to speak, but before he could, another voice spoke up from the back of the room. "She's right." All eyes turned toward a middle-aged white woman who had risen to her feet. Evelyn recognized her as one of the local business owners, a woman who had kept her distance from the protest but had watched everything unfold with quiet interest. Now, for the first time, she was stepping forward. "I've lived in this town my whole life, too," the woman said. "And I've seen it. The way black people are treated differently. I've seen the way people look at them in the grocery store, how they're followed around in shops, how their concerns are dismissed. We can't keep pretending it doesn't happen. It's time to face the truth." Evelyn felt a swell of gratitude toward the woman for speaking up. She had hoped, for so long, that more people would have the courage to admit what was happening in their community. For years, the silence had been deafening, people choosing to look away, to ignore the discomfort of acknowledging racism. But now, finally, there was a shift. One by one, others in the room began to speak. A black man who had lived in the town for over 20 years shared how he had been stopped by the police more times than he could count, for no reason other than looking suspicious. A Latina mother talked about the challenges her children faced in school, where they were treated differently because of their accents and skin color. Story after story poured out, each one a testament to the quiet, persistent undercurrent of racism that had gone unspoken for far too long. Evelyn listened to each voice, her heart heavy with both sorrow and hope. The pain in their stories was real, and it was raw, but there was also a sense of liberation in finally speaking the truth. For so long, people had been afraid to confront the reality of what was happening. Now that fear was beginning to crumble. By the end of the meeting, there was a palpable sense of change in the air. The town officials who had been present, including the mayor and several council members, could no longer deny the need for action. They promised to take the concerns seriously, to implement new policies and programs aimed at addressing racial discrimination in the town. But Evelyn knew it would take more than promises. It would take persistence and constant pressure to ensure that the changes they were fighting for became a reality. As she left the town hall that night, Evelyn felt a mixture of exhaustion and hope. The road ahead was still long, and there would be more battles to fight, but for the first time, she felt that they were moving in the right direction. The voices that had once been silenced were now being heard, and that was the first step toward real, lasting change. In the following months, Evelyn continued her work, becoming a symbol of resilience and courage for the town. The protests evolved into broader efforts to address racial inequality in every aspect of the community. Local businesses, schools, and law enforcement agencies began implementing diversity training, and new policies were put in place to ensure that complaints of discrimination were taken seriously. But while the public fight continued, Evelyn also had to contend with her private struggles. The events of the past few months had taken a toll on her, both emotionally and physically. At night, when the house was quiet and the world outside seemed far away, Evelyn found herself thinking back to that day in the mall, the moment when her dignity had been stripped away in front of strangers, the sting of those hateful words still fresh in her mind. Despite all the progress they had made, she couldn't shake the deep hurt that had been inflicted on her. It wasn't just about that one incident. It was about a lifetime of subtle slights, of being made to feel less than because of her skin color. Even now, as she stood at the forefront of a movement for change, that pain lingered. One evening, as Evelyn sat on her porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink, she heard the familiar sound of footsteps approaching. It was her granddaughter, Maya, a bright and determined young woman who had recently returned from college. Maya had been one of Evelyn's strongest supporters throughout the protests, always by her side at meetings and events, helping to organize and rally the community. "Grandma," Maya said, sitting down next to her on the porch. "You okay? You've been quiet lately." Evelyn smiled softly at her granddaughter. "I'm fine, baby. Just thinking." Maya nodded, her eyes searching Evelyn's face. "I know it's been hard, but you've done so much good. Look at everything that's changed because of you." Evelyn looked down at her hands, her fingers tracing the lines of her palms. "I know, and I'm proud of what we've accomplished, but sometimes it still hurts." Maya reached out, taking her grandmother's hand in her own. "I know. I can't imagine what it's been like for you all these years, but you're so strong, Grandma. You've been through so much, and you're still here, still fighting." Evelyn squeezed Maya's hand, grateful for the comfort of her granddaughter's presence. "It's not easy," she admitted. "I've spent my whole life trying to rise above it, trying to live with dignity in a world that didn't always see my worth. But sometimes, it feels like no matter how much things change, the hurt is still there." Maya was silent for a moment, her expression thoughtful. "I know it's not the same, but I've faced my own share of racism too. Even at college, in a place that's supposed to be progressive, there were still people who looked at me differently because of the color of my skin. It's exhausting, always having to prove yourself, always having to fight just to be treated like everyone else." Evelyn nodded, understanding all too well. "It wears you down," she said quietly. "But you can't let it break you. You have to keep going, keep standing tall. That's what I've always tried to do." Maya smiled, her eyes shining with admiration. "And you've done that, Grandma. You've shown me, and everyone else, what it means to be strong. You've inspired so many people." Evelyn smiled back, feeling a warmth in her chest that eased the lingering ache. "Thank you, baby. That means more to me than you know." They sat together in silence for a while, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The world around them seemed peaceful, but Evelyn knew that the fight for justice was far from over. There would always be more work to do, more barriers to break down, more hearts to change. But for now, in this quiet moment, she allowed herself to rest, to feel the love of her family and the strength of the community she had helped to build. In the years that followed, the changes that had begun in the town continued to grow. The protests had sparked a movement that couldn't be ignored, and the town began to evolve in ways that had once seemed impossible. The mall where Evelyn had been humiliated was now under new management, and the policies there had been completely overhauled. Diversity and inclusion were no longer just buzzwords. They were core values that shaped the way businesses and institutions operated. Evelyn, now in her late 70s, continued to play a role in the community, though she had stepped back from the public spotlight. She had done her part, and she was proud of what they had accomplished. But now it was time for the next generation to take the lead. Her granddaughter Maya had become a prominent activist in her own right, working with national organizations to address systemic racism and inequality. Watching Maya's passion and determination filled Evelyn with a deep sense of pride. She knew that the future was in good hands. One day, as Evelyn sat on her porch, sipping tea and listening to the sound of birds in the trees, Maya came to visit. She brought with her a newspaper, the front page featuring an article about a new law that had been passed, one aimed at addressing racial discrimination in public spaces. "They're calling it the Evelyn Walker Act," Maya said with a smile, handing her grandmother the paper. Evelyn's hands trembled slightly as she took the newspaper, her eyes scanning the headline. She had never expected such recognition, and the sight of her name in bold print left her momentarily speechless. "Grandma, this is because of you," Maya said, her voice filled with emotion. "Because you had the courage to stand up when no one else would. You changed things." Evelyn smiled, tears welling up in her eyes. "I didn't do it alone," she said softly. "It was all of us, working together."